April 14th, 1907. The trial, page 266. The trial began today, and I cannot blame my blunder in the courtroom on anyone but myself. Yet I feel Mr. Soper should have known what might happen. He should have known, and he should have warned me somehow. This morning, as I walked through the light drizzle to the courthouse near the Brooklyn Bridge, I felt weary from the nervous sleep. When I came within view of the huge stone building, I saw a group of women at the bottom of the wide stairway with a banner that said, "Free Mary Mallon." Bunches of angry people held signs that said, "If she's Typhoid Mary, then I'm Diphtheria Dan. Please, and release Farmer Kinley now." They furiously shouted their slogans, and I felt like they were shouting at me. At the top of the steps, Dr. Baker stood between the two great columns talking to Jonathan. Men with cameras and press hats took pictures of the protesters. The courtroom in their case was ordered closed to reporters by the judge. My heart thumped harder than as I wove through the crowd, up the stairs to the doctor, and I forced myself to meet Jonathan's eyes and say, "Good morning," a greeting that he returned. I stood beside him as we waited for Mr. Soper, who darted between two carriages and came toward us, studiously ignoring the crowd. As Mr. Soper took the last few steps, Jonathan opened the door to the courthouse, and we all went inside. We walked through the marble halls until we found the proper room, a muffled, wood-paneled square with rows of pews like a synagogue and the high podium for the judge. We took our seats behind the lawyers. Others gathered until the courtroom held their witnesses that would be called on both sides. I saw the Thompsons and the Bowings and other families who had hired Mary Mallon. Jonathan pointed out Mr. O'Neill, Mary's lawyer, and two of the men who sat behind him. He said, "They are the independent scientists who say that she doesn't carry the germs, lab rats." Outside the room I could hear the voices of men, reporters, waiting for Mary to appear, which she did shortly. But through a door in the front, accompanied by a nurse and a policeman, the room fell silent. She was well coiffed, her collar starched, and her dress clean and pressed. She seemed heavier, and she didn't look at any of us. She sat beside the lawyer and gripped her arms on the chair. Something in my chest squeezed tight, and I looked at her, the woman whose whole life had changed because of what she carried around inside of her. She had become an idea in my head, a germ theory. But there she sat, flesh and bone, and that bad, tight feeling moved all through me. The judge entered and sat the judge entered and sat, and the lawyers stated their cases. Mary Mallon versus the Department of Health and Sanitation. The first witness called was Mr. Soper, who went through the story of how he had discovered that Mary was a healthy carrier of the typhoid disease. He seemed very dignified on the stand and kept the basic scientific data which was detailed in the folios I had written of the case. He was questioned for about 20 minutes and cross-questioned for another 15, and then it was my turn. I tried to appear calm as my chief, and I repeated much of what Mr. Soper said, telling how I kept notes and followed the food trail to the peach ice cream which led to Miss Mallon. But on cross-questioning, Mr. O'Neill asked me things other than what he had asked Mr. Soper. I didn't understand where he was going until it was too late. "And how did you find out where Mary Mallon lived?" Mr. O'Neill asked. "Mr. Soper and I waited outside the house where she worked," I said. "I was away for Christmas, and when I came back, we went to a saloon and talked to a man about her who agreed to set up a meeting with her." "How did you get the man to agree with this?" the lawyer asked. I saw my mistake then. The rummy sat in the pew behind Mr. O'Neill, and I knew he had told of the monetary exchange. O'Neill brought me to the right to the confession. We offered him a few dollars. "You bribed him?" Mr. O'Neill asked. "You spied on Mary, followed her, and bribed her friend? Is that a normal protocol for the Department of Health and Sanitation, spying and bribing?" Our lawyers objected to Mr. O'Neill's translation of our actions, but the judge allowed the question. I glanced at the judge, whose bushy gray brows shaded his eyes. He waited for the answer. They all did. I felt my mouth open, 100 words clinging to the back of my tongue. I found in the crowd Mr. Soper's agonized brown eyes. I felt a great flood of anger toward him then, for leading me to this, for not warning me. Then I understood what our lawyers had said. In order to keep Mary from cooking to the public, we must explain her stubborn resistance. She was violent when we tried to approach her properly, I said. She screamed and brandished a knife at us. She threw a cooking fork at us. She curses us and doesn't believe us, and that's why she's dangerous, too. O'Neill stopped me. That's all, Miss Galewski, he said. You're excused. You may step down now. I looked at our lawyer's stricken eyes, and I returned to my seat. My row was filled with fallen faces. Only Mr. Soper met my eyes. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. Tears blurred my vision. Even Jonathan appeared disappointed. Why hadn't O'Neill asked Mr. Soper those questions? Why didn't our lawyers warn me? But I knew I had not written of the spying or the bribe or in the office notes. Our lawyers weren't aware of Mr. Soper's methods. But he should have known that I sat beside my chief, and I looked back at Mary's bunned head. I prayed she would not be freed on account of Mr. Soper's irregular ways of obtaining information, on account of my own blunder in confessing them. Dr. Baker was called to the stand next, and I made myself listen to her testimony over the hum of the distress in my head. She, too, was put to the test and asked about her decision to enter the house without a warrant, but she handled it with a cold sureness, stating that department policies and our goal to remove the evil of disease from the public sphere in any manner possible, whether the disease be water or food or human carrier. The urgency was upon us, she said firmly. You couldn't take an extra day to obtain a proper warrant from the court, O'Neill asked. No, we certainly could not, she said. A day could mean another person's illness. We didn't want to risk that. Her conviction fortified me. I vowed to myself that one day I would be as strong as she. O'Neill finished with her. A scientist was called. He talked about bacteria and the carriage of germs. He handed the judge all the papers he and the others had written. On cross, O'Neill asked the man if the theory of a healthy carrier was officially accepted by the Academy of Medicine, and the scientist had to conclude that it was not. Jonathan was called next. He gave a short lecture on the Weidel test and how Mary's samples to the independent laboratory were only feces and not as definite as the blood test. When feces are not fresh, the typhoid germ dies and the test shows as negative, he said. If you'd allow me to give her the Weidel test right now, I could show you that she is positive Mary is a dangerous carrier. That will not be necessary, Mr. O'Neill replied. A blood test is the only way to be sure. Jonathan went on. He talked about Mr. Kinley, our second healthy carrier, and I saw the judge's eyes open wider with interest. Jonathan managed to tell most of the Riverdale story, the extent of the epidemic caused by our second healthy carrier, before O'Neill insisted that he leave the stand. The day concluded with testimony from Dr. Parks, who stated that he believed that Mary carried the typhoid in her gallbladder. The judge agreed to continue hearing until all the witnesses were called, which could take another week. I left the courtroom, anxious to escape now, aware that Mr. Soper keeping pace beside me. On the street we were instantly surrounded by the press and the public wanting to know what had happened. My chief touched my shoulder, and he met my eyes and nodded. I followed close behind, and he led the way through the crowd without giving them a statement. Once we were clear of the mob, I said, I could not help it. He walked with his hands behind his back, his head bent in thought. No, it's not your fault, Prudence, he said. He seemed older and weaker to me, suddenly tired of fighting this never-ending battle against the media and Mary, who refused to understand that she carried disease. That lawyer is a nasty piece of business, Mr. Soper said, and you handled him well. The secret tasks we had performed bound us together, I saw that, and I felt able to forgive him. I felt as well a certain forgiveness from him. We walked across town in silence, our human failings a sort of truce